So I think we'll get started. Sebastian is here today, for those of you who can't see him online. Anyway, so good morning and welcome to today's forum. I'm going to be speaking first. We're going to be talking about downtown's history and the precursor churches that preceded us and that united, of course, in 1975. I will try very hard to stick to 12 minutes. And Pat will review, following this, Pat will review how the Rochester's churches, as they grew, they contributed to various philanthropical donations. And we do know mostly about Brick Church. And then I'll just do it this way here. And then Pat will review how Rochester's growth led to philanthropic donations, and Mary will describe her lived history with Central Church. She lived in the neighborhood as a child, and then she went to Central her whole life whenever she was in Rochester. So she will tell us how the churches felt as a young person. And we will leave plenty of time for questions. So in my review, I will try to remind us how Rochester has evolved, how the country has evolved, and how some themes about American Christian history are present, even really though the strains are even with us today. The past is never really past. We should first recall that the Western New York was the ancestral land of the Haudenosaunee. They sided with the British during the American Revolution, and most of their towns and crops were destroyed in the Sullivan-Clinton campaign of 1779. George Washington, in the history of the Iroquois, is called town destroyer. Peace negotiations after the war in 1783 made absolutely no provisions for the Iroquois. All the lands were given to the Americans. No lands were given to the Haudenosaunee. So First Presbyterian was founded in 1815, and Brick was it was Second Presbyterian. They split off from First in 1825, and Central came a few years later, 1836. I reviewed those three centennial books when they celebrated in 1915, 1925, 1936. And it's clear from reading that they're very proud of their heritages. They're told about their buildings, their services, and their people. But the centennial histories were all written really before the big events, almost before any of the big events of the 20th century. The centennial first is really, 1915 was the first year of the First World War. So that's before the Depression, certainly before World War II, before everything that happened after World War II. Brick was 1925, so the First World War was just fresh in their minds, but they were even before the Depression at that point. 1936 was in the middle of the Depression, but before the rise of the Nazis. And it's interesting that these the changes of the 20th century also were economically. A great migration of the remnants of the robber barons, and then the labor laws, women's suffrage. None of that is discussed in these histories. So let's get down to the history. So First Presbyterian, in 1815, Rochesterville, as we were called back then, was a village of 331 people. 16 of them formed the First Presbyterian Church of Gates in Rochesterville. And over the next 50 years, only 4 of them remained with First. So when they died, they were part of First. And most of the others actually left to form additional Presbyterian churches, and 1 member was excommunicated. The first dedicated building was erected in 1817. The first pastor actually resigned after 5 years. His working conditions and his salary were not adequate. Around the same time, of course, in 1825, the Erie Canal was completed. And by 1838, Rochester was called, quote, the young lion of the West. It was a flower city, the biggest flower producer in the United States. It was the first American boom town. So Rochester and the church grew. And then around that time, around 1820, and the first revivals came in 1825. This is the fervor of the Second Great Awakening, where the Western New York was burnt over by the spiritual fervor. And these revivals came through every few years for the next 50 years or so. The most famous revivalist was Charles Finney, and he actually lived in Rochester for 6 months in 1830. The concerns of those days, not only at First Presbyterian, but among all churches, was the moral development of the community. The people coming to the area exhibited the expected shortcomings of men coming to a boomtown. Rowdyism, drinking, corruption by, quote, the theater, circus, and the billiard rooms. These were issues that were preached about. And it was the issues of the personal morality that revivalism addressed. And it was apparently successful to a huge degree. Someone wrote, sobriety and order, industry and thrift took the place of noise and confusion, rowdyism and lawlessness. And revivals were also successful in all social classes, not only the poor, but also among working and professional classes. So all the churches of the time grew in membership and in their financial security. People came to church, they crowded after their conversions, and they stayed in churches. A Sunday's contributions in the 1850s might take in $300 or $1,200 at the time of that day, which is $12,000 and $50,000 each Sunday. Sam? These were institutions of Church 2.0. They were led by educated, dedicated, multi-talented, and multitasking preachers. The preachers were dedicated to the civic life of the city as well as the spiritual life of the congregants. In the 19th century, for churches were the days of 2 and sometimes 3 Sunday services, very large Sunday schools, proud interactions for the management and growth of the community. So First built a new church building in 1872, and the First Presbyterian Church was called the wealthy and aristocratic church of the time. The centenary history of First ends in 1915, as I said before, just at the start of First World War. And there's no mention in this history at all of his positions on slavery, abolitionism, Civil War, or women's suffrage. Brick Church split off from First in 1825. It was originally Second. It was very weak initially, and Third Presbyterian actually took members in 1827. In 1836, Central took members from Second or Brick at that time, and it really struggled to pay off its first mortgages. It was more than 10 years, around 10 years. And First Presbyterian, though, it's talking about actually Central, actually complained that the city was having too many Presbyterian churches because now there's not enough money or pastors to go around. By 1834, however, Brick Church finally was able to get free of his mortgages, and his growth and finances stabilized. Of course, revivals were very instrumental in that. Memberships rose by the hundreds in some years because of the revivals. The first church at this location on the corner of Fitzhugh Street was built in 1828, almost 200 years. The second was built in 1861, and that was enlarged in 1893. This church caught fire. It wasn't an institute building. This church caught fire in 1903, and then within a year, it was restored in this current design. The institute building we're sitting in right now was finished in 1910 and was actually a national model of how Sunday schools and other parish functions could be organized in a church in the city. That building, in fact, was vital for the participating of the church in the community. The quote in the Brick Church was, "The church could not have held its own without it." The pastors at Brick were tireless and able, and also civic leaders and fundraisers, not only for the church, but for the community. The Reverend J.B. Shaw, recognize the name, was pastor from 1840 till 1890, 50 years. The last few years he was emeritus. And when he died, it was said that everybody's father had died. His successor, Reverend William Taylor of the Taylor Chapel, was pastor for another 38 years, and both had national and international reputations in the Presbyterian Church. So Brick's history ends in 1925. Before the Great Depression, it was a church that prided itself on fundraising, its civic reputation, and its philanthropy. It participated in all the virtuous activities of the time, including the Indian assimilation movement. So brick church's history is also silent on the social issues that we could consider important nowadays. So Bethel Church, which would eventually become Central, split off from First in 1836. Their church history claims there was no discord with First, but First history actually quotes their session notes and showing their annoyance that another Presbyterian church was being formed. So history is always affected by who's writing that history. On the first 2 pages of Century's history, it is said that the first 39 members seemed to want that distinguishing characteristics were to be definite. It was to be a missionary church established upon the high principles of consecration and devotedness. It was to be so-called a free church, with its management resting solely upon the shoulders of its boards, and it would be open for free and unhampered discussion of moral questions of the day, such as slavery and temperance. Its first location on the north bank of the Erie Canal was related to an urge to do evangelistic work among the boatmen and passengers on the canal boats and packets. So Central doubled in size in its first year, built its first building in 1837, and that was at a cost of $15,000, which is $500,000. So they had funds at the time. Charles Finney returned to Rochester in 1842 again, but most of the converts for that revival apparently went to other churches. In Central's history, it was notable that many of its early members actually returned to worship in the older and stronger churches. It was never felt to be one of the strongest churches, even though it was still huge by our current standards. The Central Church building, now the Hochstein Music School, was an important Rochester landmark. This site was next to the home of Isaac and Emily Post, very prominent Quakers in Rochester who were part of the Underground Railroad. And when they died, Central just expanded into their property. But the Central Church history makes no mention of the Posts or any other abolitionists. After their first emphasis on abolition, there's nothing in the history that talked about their activities. And I don't know why that should be. We can conjecture about that. And in its current site over there, it at one time had the largest auditorium in Rochester, and there were debates within Central about how much of the use of the auditorium should be for church versus non-religious purposes. It was such a large place that, in fact, Frederick Douglass's funeral was held there in 1895 and Susan B. Anthony's in 1904. But despite that, the size, finances were somewhat tenuous. As membership was, in 1904, was actually about 2,200, and by 1936, it had dwindled to 1,500. Its 1936 budget was only $5,000 at that time, those dollars, which is 115 now. Noes commented that their local social service activities had to be limited. They could only afford $100 per family per year. They had to husband their resources, and mostly that was for emergency circumstances, not chronic support. And the women's groups were very active with sewing and donating clothing and collecting and giving out. Even then, the recipients needed, quote, to recognize that their benefits come from the church, which they owe a moral duty to repay as best they can in loyalty and service, if not in their money. So people were actually expected, you're getting donations, you should come to church with us. They were proud of their youth Bible studies and also something called the Alling Central classes for young men. These were for men. And men of the community participated in the hundreds in the early 20th century. These are not only related to church activities. They started out by talking about the Bible, not Darwin and Shakespeare, but eventually evolved to cover current events, book studies. As foreign students come in talking about their lives, there's interreligious dialogues with the Catholics and the Jewish communities, but is how to apply Jesus' teachings to everyday life. And this central history, of course, ends in 1936, and that was during the Great Depression, but before World War II and before the Great Migration of African Americans to the North. So these three churches were important and were prominent in the life of Rochester. Those times were marked by economic growth and the dominance of Protestant values in work, civics, and leisure. Churches engaged and they energized their citizens. Church-going was an expected norm. And by 1940, just after the centennial of Central, Rochester, I think, was beginning to earn its unflattering nickname, Smugtown. People of color were few and far between in that first century. In 1900, in one of those first histories, they counted, quote, 614 Negroes and Asiatics in the city. And over by 1930, the Black population actually quadrupled in the census numbers, but that still only represented 0.8% of the Rochester population. In 2020, it was 40%. Many arriving white immigrants apparently found homes in other churches. For the Irish and the Italians would end up going to Catholic churches, for instance. And even those that ended up in Protestant churches, very often they were not only coming to, and perhaps not even primarily to the Presbyterian churches. And I found it notable, as I've said several times, that in all of these history, there's no mention of the issues that we consider important. There was never again mentioned in the Central's history about activities relating to race relations, and all of this histories are silent about Jim Crow. They're silent about Indian rights. So the civil rights, as we understand it, was not discussed. Women were valued for their participation in women's societies, and there's no mention of the church's position on women's suffrage. Those centennial histories do not allude to the church's position or awareness of other issues such as manifest destiny, economic exploitation, labor laws, and so on. And they're silent on the wars of that period. The Mexican War, the Civil War, except that young men went. They really didn't talk about the slavery versus emancipation versus states' rights and union. And the Spanish-American War, which is a war of conquest, I think, we think about it now, they're not even mentioned in the histories. And of course, there was no mention of what we kind of consider the genocide of the Indian Wars. Looking back on it, it's kind of notable that they didn't know what was coming. And there's a certain degree of, I don't know what there's, I'm not sure, I had trouble identifying the emotion. What is the experience? They would get their comeuppance to that self-confidence that they had from living in a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant world. We know now that they would face postmodernism, as John Darhauer has described. Their world would no longer trust in institutional authority, and the idea of a universal truth would be declining after 1950, and learning and decision-making would become decentralized. White Anglo-Saxon Protestantism can no longer assume it has all the right answers for the world. We're not in Kansas anymore. In these times, or not those times, the world has changed, and the challenges we face is whether this church, as part of a larger Christian church, can find a voice and a message for a changed and ever-changing world. And we should remember that the Christian nationalists have an idea what the message should be. How can we battle them, although we never want to talk about them? How can we battle the Christian nationalists on the mountain, one of the 7 mountains, the mountain of religion? So I think that as we go forward with this church, we have to kind of wonder about what principles and guidelines we can use for our uncertain future. Are there really religious truths that can augment the humanistic ones? The humanistic ones, William Faulkner, I think, summarized very nicely the old verities and truths of the heart, the old universal truths, love and honor and pity and pride and compassion and sacrifice. Those are truly humanistic. But even, I think that the question is there something else beyond the humanism? And even if there's no one religion that completes our understanding of God, and can we even accept that there is no one understanding, what does Christianity bring to the conversation? And now I'm going to turn it over to you, Pat. She's going to get it out again.
Okay. Ta-da. We'll make that a slideshow. So you're going to hear 3 presentations, David's wonderful facts and insights, and I have just a few slides to pop you through in 5 minutes because then I want to turn it over to Mary. So I actually have a theme. So I'm not doing a little history, but my theme is, what about philanthropy? So Dupsey's philanthropy. So you can start by taking a look at this little item that was shared with me on Facebook. Where are all the Elon Musk cancer centers? Where are all the Elon Musk hospital wings? right? You can read down through the whole list. But the definition of philanthropy is an act or gift made for humanitarian purposes. And we could say the same thing for other billionaires, you know, what are they building? Golf courses or hospitals? So just to get you off on the right foot here. So David described the first 100 years of our three Presbyterian churches, a time of great economic growth, and then we had all the religious revivals. However, there's a very interesting little dimension, which is that when the evangelists like Finney came in, they first persuaded the middle class employers, right, that they should have a religious awakening. And then they paid their employees to come to church. Okay. And then there's a later period in the late 19th century when churches would have picnics and they would compete, right, to be a center of social life for the community. Okay, so people weren't always going to church to have like a profound spiritual experience. And that's kind of important because we get this thing of we have to have huge numbers to show that we are vibrant and impactful. But in fact, you know, the whole history of established religion sometimes is it has a social function. It's not always, you know, inspired by spirituality. So in terms of philanthropy, the United States doesn't have a big history of, you know, economic domination in the sense of, you know, total control over the people, right? So we have an economy that was, you know, pioneers and homestead based, and then there were some plantations, right? But there wasn't a huge concentration of wealth in the early United States. That came, however, with industrialization. So when you enter into the era of Rockefeller and Carnegie and Vanderbilt and Morgan, okay, wealth started to be concentrated in a small class of people, right? And so, you know, they attracted the attention of the federal government. And that's when you get Teddy Roosevelt with his trust busting. And so what these very wealthy people did was they started to create foundations and they created community projects, the Carnegie Libraries, for example. That's because Carnegie was being criticized so heavily for having such immense wealth, okay? So it's worth noting as well that in this era before federal involvement in social welfare, it was the Protestant social gospel and in Catholic charities that was providing healthcare, social services, and financial support, but to the deserving poor, okay? So what happens is that in Rochester, we have a history, actually a little bit of concentration of wealth. George Eastman was a very astute businessman, and he bought up photographic companies all over the country, right? So that Kodak was, in fact, the powerhouse of photography. And he became very wealthy as a consequence. And he decided he wasn't going to have a foundation like Ford or Rockefeller. He was just going to give it away to various, you know, things that he thought were important. And one of the things he most valued was education. So he actually built buildings for the Tuskegee Institute and the Hampton Institute and MIT and, of course, the University of Rochester. He also started, he lost all his teeth at an early age. He started free dental clinics in Rochester and 5 European countries. And he decided he was going to give his money away before he died. He wasn't going to, you know, fund a foundation. So what's meaningful for us is that he had a partner, Henry Strong. And you've all heard of Strong Memorial Hospital, okay? But he also gave away his money. First, he built a building for the Rochester Theological Seminary, And then he built this building that we're in right now. It cost about $2.7 million in those days, 1908. He also built a building for the Young Women's Christian Association, a building for the University of Rochester. He helped supplement Eastman's gift to the YMCA, and he gave major annual gifts to the community and war chests. So it's worth noting that while Strong gave the Institute building, this building, how it was furnished came about from money from the congregation. So almost $1 million in our terms came from the congregation. Okay, so, and many Brick Church congregants were Kodak executives. And Eastman gave away stock and had various social welfare programs for his employees. So to work for Kodak meant that you were quite well off, right? And so those folks tended to be attracted to Brick Church. As a consequence, Brick Church started its endowment fund in 1911. Henry Strong was one of the early donors, or maybe it might have been his bequest, but the endowment fund got an early start. Kodak treasurer Marion Folsom, if you read the notes, he was very important in starting Social Security in this country. He was a trustee of Brick Church in 1950. And at that time, the endowment was about $3 million in our terms. And the endowment was this high even after the church raised a large amount of money to repair churches damaged during World War II. Between 1925 and 1950, almost $4 million in our terms was spent by the church to build the Taylor Chapel, to remodel all the buildings, to put roofs, re-roof things. 2/3 of that came from individual donors and 1/3 came from the endowment income. So in 1950, at the beginning of suburbanization, Brick Church's congregation, as you'll see in this picture, build the sanctuary, right? The first floor, and then there they are all in the balconies, and this is before the big organ. So, you know, the sanctuary had more pews in it. So we become Dupsy with the arrival of Central Presbyterian and First Presbyterian worshipers, which makes our congregation over 1,000 people in 1974. It's worth noting that many of our most cherished programs have been, you know, voluntary labor, right? RAIN, having people living in the church. That didn't cost a whole lot of money. Like, it didn't come from the endowment. That was, you know, people doing, giving their time and labor. But now we're in a place where the endowment is at 5.7 million. And what has been our good fortune is to have an astute investment firm, which has managed to get us an 8% growth rate, which is very solid. Since 2003. However, we spend over 8%. So we're, you know, the endowment is being chipped away because we continue to want to, you know, have the staff and the programs that we do. So you should know that currently 15% of Dupsy's budget comes from pledges. The remainder is funded by our renters and others who use our facilities and by the endowment. And it's also very relevant that people like Tom Golisano, he's building his own, you know, hospitals and freestanding clinics. He's not going to build an institute building for a church. He's not. That's not his idea of philanthropy. So for years, our endowment has been enriched by member and friend bequests, even as we've had to spend to, you know, re-roof things and fix the elevator. But the thing is that with our membership at 150 now, it's unlikely that we're going to continue to have that as a way of beefing up the endowment again. I think it also might be fair to say that many of us are older in this congregation. And so we're thinking about, our own endowments and how they're going to pay for our living expenses, right? So, there's a little psychology that I saw it somewhat in House meeting notes. But what I also saw in House meeting notes was some comments from people. Is our endowment, is our spending, are we doing this simply to support the existence of our buildings? And then people asked, what if we rented instead of owned, right? Will we still be a vibrant congregation? And another suggestion that's been made is that we take the endowment and we spend it down by increasing our gifts to community organizations. So we don't, keep that steady source of income, but we take a radical approach to what we do with, how we have our heritage, how we have continue perhaps with Doopsie's philanthropy. Turning it over now to Mary.
What I want to do is a little bit different from what the other people have done. And I find it hard to talk across this much distance. So I'm hearing my father tell me anytime I went into any place, fill in the front. And if anybody's willing to move a little forward, it would be it would make things more comfortable for me.
Is that closer?
That's better. Yeah. That's a great deal better. Okay, I will hold it right up here. And okay, Elaine, I'll let you gesture to me if I forget. Because if I'm turning pages or something, I probably could. I'm not good at mics.
Of course, I might forget too.
Well, that's okay. Somebody else. I am taking it back to when I was a kid in school and for some program that I wasn't participating in. My job was sitting on the box where they kept the volleyballs at the back of the gym, which was also the auditorium, and raising my hand when I couldn't hear. So go ahead and do that. Because I know that I can have a problem. Okay. I didn't do a lot of research. In fact, I didn't do any. I don't have any statistics. I'm talking about Central Church from my perspective. And my perspective started when I was probably about in first grade. And Louise Campbell, who was Mattie Schwartz's grandmother, I'm going to use names a lot because you know quite a few of them, was my teacher. And one of the things I remember was learning songs. And we learned, Tell Me the Stories of Jesus. And she did. And we learned, Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world. And we took that to heart. And I believed her. And maybe that was my first introduction to the church as a place to build the beloved community. The beloved community, not just in the church, but the beloved community of caring for all the people in the world. At that point, we lived in the 19th Ward, but there was a neighborhood here. And across Plymouth Avenue from Hochstein, where there are now those fancy townhouses, there were buildings, and I don't remember what they looked like, but the people who lived in them were living in poverty. And mostly those weren't the people who came to the church. But we had Vacation Bible School. And I know from pictures, and I know from my mother who was teaching my class, which was probably about second or third grade, that we had most of the children for Vacation Bible School came from across the street from those apartments. We were doing it jointly with Brick. And the only reason I know that is that looking up at pictures, I'm there and Peggy Chapin is there. And when we got to high school, we were very good friends and I found out that she'd grown up in Brick. So that's exactly how much I know that was collaborative. It was at that point, I have no idea how many people there were, but it was big enough to be very active. There was a junior choir, there was a youth choir. Although I didn't know it, I met my husband at that point. I was 9 and he was about 13 and he was accompanying for his sister when we had junior choir rehearsals. And she was an Eastman student and I think she was getting paid. And I think that the choir soloists that there were 4 section leaders who got paid, because that's how my husband's family came there, because his mother had been recruited from what's now Irondequoit UCC to be the soprano soloist. And it was a church that I think was very caring. I learned a little bit about that actually at the point that I got engaged to Roger, and various people who were more my parents' age talked to me a little bit about how they'd tried to help take care of him and his sister when their mother had cancer and died when he was 7. And I did know that, casseroles had showed up. Somebody shortened his pants. Somebody invited him down to their cottage for a couple of weeks. That there was a lot of family feeling, a lot of all of the children of the church are all of our children. And I felt very safe anywhere with that. Meanwhile, trying to think about what was happening with adults. Dad was an elder, and one of the things I remember, again, thinking of reaching out and caring for each other, was that he would go with the minister to take home communion to people who couldn't get out. That on, I guess, every communion Sunday, and they weren't quite as often as they were later. They had a system which interested me with 4 elders. So 2 elders would go to a house and greet people and set up, and depending on how well the person was who they were bringing it to, help people get ready. And then the minister would come and they'd have communion. Meanwhile, the second pair of elders would go on to the next house, so that the minister was covering more territory, but that each family got a longer visit and a little more friendliness, and that there were those 2 elders, so that it was the congregation, not just the minister, who was coming, so that this was bringing part of the congregation to people. I know that we did that at Dipsy. I can't tell you exactly till when, but I remember going to do it with Tony Ricciuti. So that period. One of the things that I didn't pay attention to then, because it was the way things were, but I did notice very much when we came over to this building, was there was always a lot of building staff here, and there wasn't very much staff there. I don't know. I know there was a secretary, and there must have been a custodian. But boy, I remember being recruited to put up and take down the folding chairs and get things ready, and even help sweep up and stuff from a very early age. And in some ways, that was something I missed when we came here, because it made it feel as though it feel less like our house and more professional or something. I'm not quite sure the word I want there. We didn't have an endowment. And I probably heard and learned a lot more than most people did, because my father was chair of stewardship for a long time. And so it got it came up at the dinner table, not just in church, on how we were going to handle things, how we were going to help people think in terms of their church contributions being a percentage of their income, not just one of many charitable donations, not just another charitable, and that we were giving, I love those words, our time, our talent, and our worldly substance. And that it was important to give your time and your talent as well as your worldly substance. My worldly substance was minimal at that point. I got, starting with a nickel for church and a nickel for me. And it worked up eventually to a quarter, which was more than tithing of my allowance. But I also remember enjoyably, because the high school kids were recruited into doing things like this, making kind of a flip chart on all the things that the church spends its money on, and a puppet we called Chester Church Mouse. And when I must have been, I don't know, 14, 15, my job was taking that around to the younger classes and talking about it with pictures that showed we need heat and we need to pay people and we need money to give to people outside the church and money to give to people who are hungry and all of that sort of thing. So I grew up from a really early age having that be one of the things we learned, that this is something we're all doing together. I was lucky enough to have had some wonderful Sunday school teachers. And as I got older, I was lucky to have some wonderful Sunday school teachers, including Ellie Newell. Just kind of wanted you to know that. And in high school, Ozzie Salyards and Ozzie and eventually Marge, the high school group supervised their courtship. We were all invited to the wedding. We were all very interested when they were going to have a baby. We participated possibly more than they really wanted. We were really involved. And the two of them, and Dan and Elizabeth Gordon, worked with fellowship. At that point in high school, we did some exchanges with AME Zion, where we visited them and they visited us, and with Bris Kodesh. And kind of anything that we were curious or interested in, we would plan with the kids doing a lot of the planning. We're going to learn about that. So we began to learn quite a bit about civil rights and quite a bit about other kinds of churches and other ways that people worshiped. And I can remember always feeling that if there's something we want to learn about and if we want to talk about it, that's okay. That it will be welcomed and that we will be helped in finding ways to do that. And just as I was working on stewardship, I know that other kids were sometimes following their interest and sometimes truthfully following their parents, because there's always the problem of transportation, to be involved in other teams and other things in the church. I realized as I listened to Pat and to David, one important thing, and this was probably beginning to change right then in the late 50s. A very high percentage of us lived in the city. I lived in the 19th Ward. The Tickners, Marion Tickner, did kindergarten here for years, so some of you remember her. A couple of other families, the Quines, and then some families like Mrs. Campbell's and Judy Foster and her brother lived just over the city line into Gates. So for anything from choir practice to youth group to, I guess, sometimes Sunday school, and then the rest of the parents came time for church, it was easy to have carpools. And it was easier to get down. A whole bunch of us from there, I guess probably all of that group, by the time we were in high school, went to West High School. So if you wanted to try to do something on a weekday afternoon, we did a lot of plays and stuff. And so you sometimes needed that for rehearsal. We could take a bus right from school and be there in 10 minutes. And within not too many years after that, people started moving farther out to the suburbs. And getting down here was much more dependent on somebody driving you and harder to have carpools. And that did make a difference, I think, in how easy it was to be a really active youth group. Certainly in my youth, no kid had a car. And pretty much no kid had access to a car, and you needed to be 18 to drive after dark anyway. So that took care of it. But it wasn't very hard to get down on your own even. And it wasn't very hard for somebody to pick you up. And a lot of the adults worked downtown. So if they were giving you a ride home after maybe an extra practice for something. I remember waiting by what's now that side door of Hochstein. You know, you watch and I'll swing by and come out and have somebody picking you up on the way home from work. And I think that that's critical. I'm mentioning one thing from that period that made a great impression on me. That was the point that there was an uprising in Hungary to try to throw off the Soviet Union. And Rochester suddenly got a lot of Hungarian refugees. And as I'm sure the adults were talking about what to do about them, I remember, and people coming quickly and coming in the winter and coming with nothing. And I remember my mother telling me to please go up to my room and look through my closet, and anything that I'd outgrown or was starting to outgrow, I was to bring down. And I was at an age of quite a lot of growing, so there was quite a lot. And I have a very clear visual memory of the folding tables lining both sides of that big entry hallway as you come in from the Plymouth Avenue entrance. And many of you have been in Hochstein to visualize that. And all of those tables piled so high that things were slipping. Because lots of situations where I was a kid, we didn't have money, but we were certainly told, but this is something you can do. These are ways that you can help. These are ways that you could reach out. And feeling very much that even if you were a kid or a teenager, you were a needed part of the church. Okay, about this point, we get to 1960 and I went away to college. And the only thing I can remember particularly doing at the church during those college years, although I know a lot of active things were going on, was one summer when there were some people working with migrants. And somewhere that was mentioned that they were trying to have some play areas for younger children. I think that maybe this was during times that they were doing English classes, or maybe it was just in general, but that it was so hard to get dolls with dark skin. I make excellent rag dolls. I made excellent rag dolls then too. And I thought, well, it's not hard. You just get brown material instead of pinkish material. And so we had a really wonderful time that summer for several evenings. A couple of people brought their sewing machines down. And, you know, if you're going to make a few, you might as well make a lot while you're at it. and making vast numbers of very satisfactory, carefully made dolls with clothes to be something that could be available to children who were coming to whatever gatherings was this migrant program. So that was just one little thing. Another thing I remember loving but not having much participation of, because it really started about the time I was leaving, was a religious arts festival, which brought together people bringing in paintings, people bringing in poetry, people sending in manuscripts of plays, people with musical compositions, and this went on for about a week. The artwork was displayed, and quite a lot of it was for sale. There were a couple of paintings that hung in my parents' living room for the rest of my life that came from that. And it was very exciting to be going to a concert that was newly composed music and going to a play that was just written, and they do a book of the poems. And that drew entries from all over the country and was quite the event. Okay, as I said, I was away at Cornell for 4 years. Then I was back in Rochester for 1 year, and I came to church, and I came a little bit to Downtowners, which was a very active group, yes, a very active group of young people who were out of college, 20-somethings. And even though I didn't come very many times, like quite a lot of other people who came to Downtowners, I came out of it with a husband. And I can think of the Horns, Judy Foster, and if I thought harder, I could find quite a few other people. They did, some of them were just fun things, and some of them were sort of community things. I remember because it was a significant day. Afterward, we went caroling to the Presbyterian home, and then quite a few individual houses where there were people who were shut-ins. And I remember parts of that vaguely, and more significantly what happened afterward, because I was married 6 months later. And that was a significant night. But the caroling was also a worthwhile thing that was going on. Then we lived in other places for 4 years and came back in '69 because Roger was going to work on his doctorate at Eastman. And we moved to Rochester, back to Rochester on a Saturday. And we stayed with my folks until the next few days till RG&E turned things on. But we went to church on Sunday morning. On Sunday afternoon, we were still at my parents', and that was good because we didn't have a phone yet. And I got a call from Judy Foster saying, "Oh, good, you're back in Rochester. You can teach Sunday school." And I said, "We do not even have the kitchen unpacked or our clothes unpacked or gas or electricity. And I have a 5-week-old baby." She said, "That's fine. Could you start next Sunday?" She said, "We've got somebody really good in the nursery, and it connects with the preschool room where you'll be, so you can check on the baby if you need to. Just come early and feed her right before you start. It'll be fine." So I put her in her best blue dress and took her brother, and we came. And I remember we had lots of kids. We were still just 3 separate churches, but General Assembly came during that next couple of years. And everybody was supposed to make, it was over at the Blue Cross Center, which is sort of bleak because it doesn't have anything. So we were all supposed to make giant paper banners. And I remember with satisfaction that you were treating them like some people are short, but we are all part of the family. That even my 3-year-olds made like a 6x3 banner. I also remember more significantly, because theirs was pretty splashy, working on a long hanging felt banner, which I had the fun of helping design, because we were wanting that to be the beloved community, slightly abstract, showing different ages, genders, races, as much variety as we could pack into it and still have the figures big and significant. And that one that we did, working carefully to get the right color felt, was a biracial baby. Because at that point, and I know that there were many difficulties with this afterward, but at that point, people were being very much encouraged, if they were adopting, to adopt a biracial baby who often was having trouble finding a home, either with a Black family or a white family. And this was Michael Horn. And I remember very much Ellen talking about they had had a baby daughter who had died when she was only hours old the summer before. And Ellen and I were already beginning to be friends, and her saying to me that they had talked with David McMillan, who was our minister, and talked about the baby that needed them, not the baby that they needed or thought they needed. And Michael was welcomed, and so were Tammy and Becky. And then there were enough biracial adoptions or interracial adoptions so that I needed to deal with quite a lot of complaints from my daughter, who was about, by that time, 3 or 4, on why couldn't we have an adapter too? She would have liked a little sister, and it seemed that it was quite easy. And why didn't we have one like everybody else? And I do know from some of those families that I was close to that the children were made very welcome, and that this was a good place. One of the things that had interested me, also involving children, and that I missed out on, because it was during the years I was in college, but during the years I was in high school, I was helping sometimes with the preschool and the nursery. And we had one little boy who had fairly severe intellectual disabilities. Well, that worked okay with preschool and not so okay older. And so his parents talked to the church, and they made a particular Sunday school class for kids with intellectual disabilities, which drew in families. Okay, 1:15, and I will be done in 2 seconds. Okay.
Oh, Mary, I noticed that you're looking down at your notes, and I've just been given a time check of it's
I'm-
10:45.
I'm at the point of trying to do, of about to do a final sentence. Okay, that's why I looked down at my notes. Okay, I could obviously go on quite a lot. At that point, some of us were feeling very committed to the urban frontier, wanting to build the city. But what I really want to end with is exactly that beloved community, that caring about each other. And the songs were still important. The 2 that I remember from that period are I Am the Church and You Are the Church and We Are the Church Together. The church is not a building. We are the church together. And the other one was We Are One in the Spirit. And very little feeling that, Presbyterians had to work with Presbyterians, that we could work with all kinds of other people who wanted to build a beloved community as much as we did. And that we were saying, and they'll know we are Christians by our love. And if I wanted to end with what was important when we became one church instead of 3, that was what was important. That they know we are Christians by our love. Okay? All
Beautiful.
So we really need to get downstairs, don't we? Any questions for any of us?
Just to remind you that next week we do our biblical narrative. And I think we could actually start, that out with a little bit of a recap of what we talked about today. So since we're not getting an opportunity for questions today, if you would please come next week.
And and maybe we'll even set up more as a round. Thank you, Mary, for reminding us that works very well for many of us. Hi, Mary. Hi, Peg. Hi, Marie.
Ed and Nancy.
Ed and Callie are there too. Anyway, so that was, boy, I worked hard on this, you worked hard on this, and my mind is still, it's inspired, but also kind of troubled by, this is kind of the funny history that, the circumstances are pushing us in some direction, but we don't know where it's going. But there's a good heritage here. There's something
Amen.
pretty solid.
Thank you.
No question, really. Just like I could say, fabulous job by all three. I mean, really great insights and terrific history that David pulled out. I don't know. I mean, we want to keep all this presentation and the tape of it and all the preparation that you did, and also you, Pat. That's really fascinating to hear all the connections we had over the years to some very generous givers. Maybe they felt obligated, but I'm wonderful that how it worked out.
Okay, I want to throw in just one more very quick thing, because David said, as we talked preparing, and I forgot this one because it was coming at the end, that I loved Central Church and I loved that building. Like every kid who grows up in a big church, I knew all the corners, and including the ones that grown-ups didn't go to. I knew how to go under the sanctuary, the boilers. But I do remember the treasurer then was Don Beck of the Becks, who endowed the Beck Scholarship. And they lived pretty close to us. So he was giving me a ride home one day from something or other. This is in the last couple of years before the merger. And he mentioned, we better move along on this because we're going to run out of money in 18 months. So maybe we better figure things out before we get to that.
Don't give it all away.
No risk of that. We won't go out here.
They open it up and give it all away, then it'll.
We have missed you.
Yeah.